There are moments in a chosen one's journey when silence becomes louder than words, when prayers feel heavy, when your heart feels betrayed by someone you once called sister. And in those moments, God is not absent. He is working in secrecy. Listen carefully, because this is not just a message, it is a spiritual awakening. God says, I am removing the veil. There is someone in your circle who speaks like love, but carries the spirit of envy. Someone who smiles with you, but competes with you in silence. Someone who calls you sister, but celebrates your delays more than your destiny. And you didn't see it before because your heart was pure. You projected loyalty because that is what you give. But God is now revealing what your love tried to overlook, not to break you, but to protect you. Because chosen ones cannot go into their next season carrying counterfeit relationships. Hear this deeply. Not everyone assigned to you is appointed for you. Some people are divine lessons, not lifelong connections. And God is saying, I allowed the mask to stay on until your purpose matured enough to see clearly. Now things are shifting. Conversations feel different. Energy fee. LS off. Distance is forming without explanation. And truth is leaking through the cracks of what was once familiar. This is not confusion. This is exposure. And yes, it will hurt. Because betrayal from someone close always cuts deeper than enemies from afar. But God says, I am not exposing them to destroy you, I am exposing them to deliver you. Because if they stayed hidden, they would have stayed harmful. You prayed for loyalty, and God answered by revealing disloyalty. You asked for peace, and God removed hidden disturbance. You asked for growth, and God removed what was stunting it. And even though it feels like loss, it is actually alignment. Let them walk away when the truth surfaces. Do not chase what God is removing. Do not grieve what God is exposing. Do not beg for what God is closing. Because chosen one, your next level requires clean relationships, not complicated ones. And here is the hard truth. Sometimes the fake sister is not loud in her betrayal, she is subtle in her sabotage. Subtle in discouragement, subtle in comparison, subtle in energy that always shifts when you start winning. But God sees what you don't say out loud, and now He is stepping in. He is separating you, not from people, but from poison disguised as closeness. And you may feel alone for a moment, but you are not abandoned. You are being set apart. Because God does not expose what He does not plan to elevate you beyond. So let them go with peace, not bitterness. Let truth stand without your revenge. Let God handle what your heart cannot carry. And remember this, when God exposes someone, He is also exposing your next level. Because after this separation comes clarity. After this clarity comes peace. After this peace comes elevation. And you will look back and say, now I understand why God removed them. You are not losing a sister. You are losing an illusion, so you can finally walk in truth. Sometimes God allows you to sit in the presence of people who look like answers, but are actually questions. And one of the most dangerous disguises is not an enemy from outside, but a sister from inside your circle who smiles while studying your weaknesses in silence. You don't notice it at first because betrayal rarely introduces itself with noise. It arrives gently, wrapped in familiarity, decorated with trust, and dressed in shared history. And this is here the chosen ones get tested the hardest, not in the battlefield of enemies, but in the living room of relationships where comfort blinds discernment. There is a type of person who will laugh with you today and measure your downfall tomorrow, not because you harmed them, but because your light makes them uncomfortable. God sees the hidden conversations, the silent comparisons, the energy shifts when your name is mentioned in rooms you are not present in. And while you were praying for loyalty, heaven was already collecting evidence of deception, not to shame you, but to save you. This is why God does not always expose people immediately. He waits until your heart is strong enough to see without breaking completely. Because premature revelation can destroy what delayed obedience is meant to protect. And some truths are heavy enough to collapse fragile faith if revealed too early. So God lets the smile stay a little longer, lets the conversations continue, lets the closeness feel real, until the moment your spirit becomes ready to discern what your emotions ignored. And then something subtle begins to happen. Your peace starts to withdraw in their presence. Your clarity starts to fade when they speak. Your spirit becomes restless around what used to feel safe. This is not coincidence. This is divine alertness. This is God gently pulling your attention towards something your loyalty refused to investigate. And still, you hesitate, because history creates emotional blindness, and shared memories can sometimes speak louder than present truth. You remember the laughter, the advice, the support during certain seasons, and you convince yourself that someone who was good once must still be good now. But God does not judge people by their best moments. He reveals them by their consistent spirit, especially when your breakthrough begins to rise. And suddenly, the same person who once encouraged you starts to hesitate when you progress, starts to go quiet when you win, starts to shift when your name is honored. That shift is not random, it is revelation unfolding in behavior, because what lives inside a person eventually speaks louder than what comes out of their mouth. And this is where God begins to whisper to your spirit, not through fear, but through discomfort that cannot be ignored anymore. You start to question things you used to defend. You start to feel distant, NCE, where there was once closeness, and you begin to notice patterns you were too loyal to see before. And God says, this is not confusion, this is exposure beginning, because what I hide for your protection, I will reveal for your direction. But exposure does not always feel like victory at first. Sometimes it feels like heartbreak, sometimes it feels like betrayal, sometimes it feels like loss. Yet in the kingdom, loss is often the language of protection, and separation is often the mercy you didn't know you needed. And while your heart struggles to accept what your spirit already knows, heaven continues to align you away from what cannot go with you into your next dimension. And still unfolding, there are moments when God allows the fake sister to stay close long enough for your discernment to mature beyond emotion. Because if it was removed too early, you would have called it coincidence instead of revelation. So he watches, not with neglect, but with intention, letting patterns repeat just enough for truth to become undeniable to your spirit. And every repetition of inconsistency is a quiet sermon from heaven saying, pay attention, do not ignore what you feel repeatedly. But, because you are chosen, your heart is tender, and tenderness often fights against truth when truth comes dressed as discomfort. You try to rationalize it, you try to excuse it, you try to preserve what God is already preparing you to release. And this inner conflict is where spiritual awakening begins, because discernment is born in tension between loyalty and truth. Then one day, something shifts, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, like a veil lifting from your perception. And you begin to see that the same sister you defended in conversations is the same energy that kept blocking your peace in private moments. It was never obvious because deception does not announce itself, it blends, it adapts, it survives in familiarity. And now God says, I am not exposing them to harm you, I am exposing them to heal you from what you ignored. Because what you tolerate spiritually becomes what limits you naturally, and what you excuse emotionally becomes what delays you prophetically. And even though it feels like pain, it is actually preparation disguised as loss, because God is never chaotic in his removals. He is intentional, precise, and deeply aware of what your future requires, etc. When your present emotions cannot understand it. So he removes the smile that hides the truth, so you can finally meet the truth that was hiding behind the smile. And when the exposure settles in your spirit, you will realize that peace was never in the presence of everyone who called you sister, but in the alignment of those who were truly assigned by God, those who do not compete with your light, but reflect it, those who do not envy your growth but encourage it, and those whose presence does not confuse your spirit but confirms your peace. And when you begin to walk forward without hesitation, because the fog has lifted and the truth has become clear in your spirit and still unfolding now. There is a moment in every chosen one's journey when God begins to remove the covering from what you were emotionally dependent on, not to hurt you, but to awaken you. And this is where the shaking begins, not the shaking of your physical world first, but the shaking of your perception. Because what God removes first is not always people, but the illusion you built around them. You thought you knew who stood with you, but God says, I am about to show you who was standing near you but not for you. And this is never comfortable because the heart resists what the spirit begins to recognize. The same sister you trusted begins to feel different, not because she suddenly changed, but because your awareness has been opened. God has a way of making familiar things feel unfamiliar when He is trying to save you from spiritual blindness. And so you start noticing things you ignored before. The tone in her voice shifts when you share good news. The silence after your blessings is no longer neutral, it feels heavy. The encouragement that once flowed freely now feels selective, calculated, measured, and God whispers, this is not your imagination. This is revelation beginning to unfold in real time. When God starts removing masks, He does not always do it through confrontation. He does it through exposure of patterns. You will hear less words and see more behavior. You will notice that the energy you once dismissed was actually communication all along. Because in the spiritual realm, consistency is louder than language. And suddenly, memories begin to replay in your mind with new understanding. Moments where you were vulnerable and it was shared elsewhere. Conversations that felt so but were later misused. Advice that seemed supportive but subtly redirected your confidence. And you begin to realize that deception rarely arrives as hatred, it arrives as distorted care. It sounds like concern but carries hidden competition. It feels like closeness but operates with internal distance. And God says, I allowed you to feel it now so you would not miss it later when the stakes are higher. There is a spiritual principle unfolding here that chosen ones often struggle with. God does not expose people when your emotions are ready, He exposes them when your destiny requires it. Because if it depended on your feelings, you would always delay your deliverance. And so He begins to withdraw His covering from relationships that cannot survive truth. Not because He is cruel, but because He is precise. Some connections only exist because ignorance sustained them. And when light increases, shadows cannot remain the same. This is why confusion increases before clarity arrives. Because what was hidden begins to surface in layers, not all at once, so your spirit can adjust without collapsing under the weight of sudden truth. You start feeling a quiet internal resistance around certain people. Not anger, not hatred. Just a deep knowing that something is no longer aligned. And this knowing becomes stronger in moments where words fail but intuition speaks loudly. You try to dismiss it at first because loyalty is still active in your emotional memory, but God keeps confirming it through subtle disruptions. Delayed responses, emotional distance, energy shifts that cannot be explained logically. And you begin to realize that God is communicating through discomfort, because comfort would have kept you blind, but discomfort is what forces awareness. And then God begins to reveal something deeper, not only who they are, but who you were around them. Because exposure is not just about others, it is also about how you positioned yourself in relationships that were never equal. You were open, they were selective. You were transparent, they were strategic. You were building, they were observing. And God says, I am showing you this not to make you bitter, but to make you wise. Because wisdom is the byproduct of surviving what you once misunderstood. And still, the hardest part is not the revelation, it is the emotional withdrawal that follows it. Because once truth enters your awareness, you cannot unknow it. You can delay responding to it, but you cannot erase it. And so you find yourself in a silent transition where your spirit is already leaving, but your emotions are still trying to stay. This is where God begins the separation process internally before it becomes external. He changes how you feel before he changes who is physically around you. Because if the heart does not detach first, the body will resist the shift. You may even start questioning yourself during this stage, asking if you are overthinking, if you are misreading signs, if you are becoming distant for no reason. But God says, I am not making you paranoid, I am making you perceptive. There is a difference between fear and discernment. Fear imagines danger. Discernment recognizes it without needing confirmation. And what you are sensing is not confusion, it is clarity forming in layers your emotions are not used to yet. And then comes the most difficult realization. God is removing the mask from someone you prayed for, someone you defended, someone you invested emotional trust into. And this creates internal tension because your prayers and your perception feel like they are now in conflict. But God says, I heard your prayers and I am answering them in a way your emotions did not expect, because you prayed for growth, not realizing that growth requires separation. You prayed for elevation, not realizing elevation requires isolation from what cannot rise with you. And as this unfolds, your spirit begins to enter a state of quiet detachment, not coldness, but clarity, not bitterness, but understanding. And you start to see that what once felt like deep connection was actually surface alignment maintained by familiarity, not destiny. And now God is removing everything that was sustained by emotional attachment rather than divine assignment. And as he does, the truth becomes less painful and more revealing. Because once the mask is removed, you no longer need to guess, interpret, or question, you simply see. And what you see begins to change how you move, how you speak, how you trust, how you pray, and how you discern what is being built around you. And still unfolding as the layers continue to reveal what was hidden beneath years of emotional assumption and spiritual silence, there is a kind of pain that does not arrive like a storm, but like a slow keening, where truth does not break into your life all at once, but seeps into your spirit in layers you cannot escape. And this is where chosen ones often struggle the most, not in the moment of exposure itself, but in the waiting period where truth is present but not yet fully understood. Because God rarely reveals everything at once. He reveals just enough for your spirit to start feeling what your emotions are still denying. And that tension creates inner discomfort, a quiet unease that follows you even in peaceful environments, because what is being revealed cannot be unseen once your awareness is opened. The pain of slow revelation is not loud. It does not always come with confrontation or betrayal in a single defining moment. Instead, it comes through repeated small awakenings that gradually reshape how you perceive someone you once trusted deeply. You begin to notice inconsistencies that never bothered you before. Words that used to comfort you now feel hollow when you replay them. Smiles that once brought reassurance now feel like masks you cannot unsee. And this is not because people suddenly changed overnight, but because your discernment has been activated by God's timing. What was always there is now being revealed in stages your heart can process without completely breaking. And still, there is resistance inside you, because emotional memory fights against spiritual revelation. You remember the laughter, the shared secrets, the moments where you felt seen and understood. And those memories try to argue against what your spirit is now discerning. This is where confusion is born, not because truth is unclear, but because attachment refuses to let go of what familiarity built. And God allows this tension because he knows that premature separation without understanding would leave you emotionally bound to deception even after it is revealed. Slow revelation is painful because it forces you to reevaluate not only the person in front of you, but your own judgment. You begin questioning yourself. How did I not see this earlier? Why did I ignore these signs? Was I blind, or was I just hopeful? And in these questions, God is not condemning you, he is refining your perception. Because chosen ones are not punished for trusting, they are trained to discern beyond appearances. And what you once interpreted as loyalty is now being redefined as spiritual sensi, activity that needed maturity. There are nights where your mind replays conversations you once dismissed. You start hearing tone shifts you ignored at the time. You remember moments where something felt off, but you chose peace over perception. And now those same moments return with clarity you did not have before. This is how revelation works. It does not always bring new information. Sometimes it reinterprets old experiences with new light. And that light can feel heavy because it changes the emotional meaning of what you thought was safe. God allows this heaviness because He is dismantling emotional illusions that could have kept you stagnant. And yet, while this is happening internally, externally life often continues as normal for others around you. People do not see the shift happening inside you. They do not see how your spirit is slowly detaching from what your presence is still physically connected to. And this creates isolation, not because you are alone, but because your awareness is now ahead of your environment. You are seeing things that others still interpret through emotional attachment, and that difference creates silent distance. And in this process, the chosen one, often wrestle with guilt. Because you still care, but you also see clearly. And caring while seeing clearly creates emotional conflict. You do not hate them, but you can no longer ignore what God is revealing. You do not wish harm, but you can no longer pretend harmony exists where discernment has already exposed imbalance. And this is where many struggle to pray the same way, to laugh the same way, to engage the same way, because innocence has been replaced by awareness. And God says, this discomfort is not punishment, it is preparation. Because I am training your spirit not to confuse familiarity with alignment. Not everything that feels close is called to stay close. Not everything that once supported you is still supporting your destiny. And what you are experiencing is the separation between emotional loyalty and spiritual truth. There is also a deeper layer of pain that comes from realizing that the exposure is not dramatic. It is subtle. It is almost quiet enough to ignore if you choose to stay emotionally invested. And this is why many people miss God's warnings. They wait for loud confirmation when God is speaking through patterns. He is not always in the earthquake. Sometimes He is in the repeated silence after certain conversations. Sometimes He is in the lack of celebration when you win. Sometimes He is in the energy that changes when you enter a room. And chosen ones begin to feel this before they fully understand it. And as this continues, something inside you begins to detach slowly, not instantly, not violently, but gradually, like a cord being loosened without your permission. You start sharing less. You start observing more. You start protecting your peace without fully realizing you are already being separated. And this is where God begins to protect you from emotional dependency that could delay your obedience later. But even in this protection, there is grief, because you are mourning something that has not fully ended yet. You are grieving the version of the relationship you believed was real. And this grief is complicated because the person is still present, but the connection is shifting. And that in-between space is where confusion lives, where pain lingers, where clarity is still forming but not fully established. God allows this because He is teaching you how to handle truth without self-destruction. If everything was revealed, instantly, your emotions might collapse under the weight of sudden realization. But slow revelation builds spiritual endurance. It teaches you how to carry truth without losing peace. It trains your spirit to remain grounded even when emotional familiarity is dissolving. And through all of this, one thing becomes clear. God is not exposing to destroy your relationships randomly, but to refine your discernment permanently. Because once you see patterns through His light, you cannot unsee them. And once your spirit learns to recognize subtle misalignment, you will no longer be easily deceived by appearance or words or history alone. You begin to see energy, consistency, fruit, and alignment more than promises or emotions. And even though it hurts to adjust, Even though it feels like loss unfolding slowly rather than suddenly, there is a deeper awareness forming inside you that cannot be reversed. A quiet understanding that not every connection was meant to last, not every sister was meant to stay, not every bond was built on truth, and not every closeness was approved by God, and still unfolding as the weight of revelation continues to reshape how your spirit understands trust, timing, and divine protection. There comes a point in the journey of a chosen one when God stops simply revealing and starts separating. And this separation is not sudden like the world expects it to be, but deeply intentional, almost surgical, where every connection that cannot survive truth begins to loosen from your life without force, without chaos, but with divine precision. And this is where many become confused, because the separation does not always look like loss at first. It looks like distance. It looks like silence. It looks like shifts in energy that cannot be explained logically, but are felt deeply in the spirit. And God says, this is not abandonment, this is alignment. The divine separation process is one of the most misunderstood seasons in a chosen one's life, because it often arrives when you still care, when you still remember, when your heart is still emotionally attached to what your spirit is already being released from. And that internal conflict creates tension that feels like emotional instability, but in reality it is spiritual reordering. Because God does not always remove people while your emotions are ready, He removes them when your destiny requires clarity. And clarity often demands separation from confusion disguised as closeness. You begin to notice that interactions change without explanation. The conversations that once flowed effortlessly now feel forced. The warmth that once existed now feels conditional. The openness that once defined the connection now feels limited, measured, cautious. And you try to understand what changed externally, but God is revealing that the change started internally long before it became visible. Because when God begins separation, He first changes perception, then interaction, then proximity, and finally attachment. And in this process, the chosen ones often try to restore what is being divinely removed. They reach out more. They explain more. They try to fix what is not responding to human effort anymore. But God allows these attempts so you can see that not everything can be repaired through emotional effort when spiritual alignment has already shifted. And this is where surrender becomes necessary, not surrender in weakness, but surrender in understanding that what God is closing cannot be forced open again without resistance. There is also a deeper pain in this season, because divine separation rarely comes with visible conflict. There is no dramatic argument to justify the distance. There is no clear moment of betrayal that gives closure. Instead, there is ambiguity, and ambiguity is what makes this process emotionally heavy. Because the mind keeps searching for a reason while the spirit already knows the answer. And this gap between knowing and accepting creates internal struggle that feels like confusion, but is actually transition. God begins to remove emotional access before physical presence changes. You may still see the person, still hear from them occasionally, still exist in shared spaces, but something has shifted in the way your spirit responds. Where there was once peace, there is now caution. Where there was once openness, there is now observation. Where there was once trust, there is now discernment. And this is not bitterness forming, this is awareness maturing. And in this maturing, God begins to silence certain emotional ties that once held strong influence over your decisions. You stop sharing everything. You stop seeking validation. You stop relying on their perspective to confirm your direction. Not because you chose distance first, but because God is reducing dependency that could compromise your discernment later. Because chosen ones cannot carry into their next level relationships that influence their obedience through emotional attachment rather than divine alignment. And yet, even in this process, there is grief, because you are watching something dissolve that once felt meaningful. And the grief is not always about the person, it is about the version of the connection you believed was real. You grieve the expectations, the imagined loyalty, the assumed alignment. And this grief does not always look like sadness. Sometimes it looks like numbness, sometimes like overthinking, sometimes like emotional withdrawal that you cannot fully explain. God allows this grief because it purifies attachment. It removes emotional dependence that could have become a limitation. And while you are experiencing this inwardly, externally life continues shifting quietly. Conversations become shorter. Responses become delayed. Energy becomes inconsistent. And instead of forcing clarity, God begins to train you to recognize patterns without needing verbal confirmation. Because spiritual maturity is when you no longer require explanation. To recognize misalignment. There are moments in this process where you feel almost guilty for noticing change, because loyalty makes you question whether you are overanalyzing, whether you are becoming distant for no reason, whether you are misunderstanding people you once trusted deeply. But God says, I am not making you suspicious, I am making you sensitive, because sensitivity in the spirit is protection, not paranoia. It is awareness of what words cannot always reveal. And slowly, without force, God begins to reposition your heart, not by hardening it, but by detaching it from what cannot carry your future. And this repositioning is subtle. You still care, but differently. You still remember, but without emotional pull. You still see, but without confusion. And this shift is what creates separation without destruction. Because God does not always remove relationships by ending them, sometimes He removes their influence over your direction. As this continues, you begin to realize that divine separation is not just about people leaving your life, it is about your spirit leaving dependency on what cannot remain. And that realization changes how you interpret distance. You stop seeing it as rejection and begin to understand it as redirection. You stop interpreting silence as abandonment and begin to recognize it as alignment in progress. You stop fighting what is fading and start observing what God is revealing through fading connections. And still, there is resistance at times, because the heart remembers faster than the spirit detaches. You may find yourself revisiting old conversations, questioning timing, replaying memories, trying to locate where exactly things shifted. But God does not always show you the exact moment of change, because sometimes understanding the process would keep you emotionally tied to it. Instead, He reveals the outcome first so you can release what the process would otherwise keep you bound to. And in this unfolding, something powerful begins to happen. Your discernment sharpens beyond emotional influence. You begin to see without needing confirmation. You begin to feel without needing explanation. You begin to know without needing proof. And this is the quiet fruit of divine separation, not isolation, but clarity that no longer depends on emotional proximity to function. And even though it feels like things are being removed, in truth God is clearing space for alignment that does not require confusion to survive. And still unfolding as the separation continues, shaping your spirit into a place where clarity becomes your default state, rather than emotional uncertainty. After the exposure and the separation, there is a quiet moment in the spirit that feels like emptiness to the natural mind, but feels like space in the divine realm. And this is where many chosen ones misunderstand what God is doing, because when noise leaves, they assume something is missing, when in reality, something has just been removed so something greater can begin to form. God never exposes and removes without intention for elevation. Every removal is connected to an upgrade that your current environment could not sustain. And this is why what feels like loss is actually the beginning of recalibration. Elevation after exposure is not loud. It does not announce itself with celebration at first. It begins in silence, in subtle clarity, in a deep internal reset where your spirit starts to feel lighter, not because everything is perfect, but because confusion is no longer clouding your perception. And that clarity becomes the first sign that God has moved you into a different spiritual dimension. Because when God elevates, He does not just add things to your life, He first removes what cannot exist in the next level without becoming a limitation. You begin to notice that your emotional responses change. Situations that once triggered confusion no longer hold the same weight. Conversations that once would have pulled you into overthinking now pass without disturbance. And this is not because you have become cold, but because your spirit has been trained through exposure and separation to no longer assign value to inconsistency. You start valuing peace more than presence, alignment more than history, and truth more than emotional attachment. And this is where elevation begins internally before it becomes visible externally. Because God never elevates a person publicly before stabilizing them privately. And the private stabilization is what most people do not see. It is the process of emotional detox, where old connections lose influence, where inner dependence on validation begins to dissolve, where your identity becomes less tied to who surrounds you and more connected to who guides you spiritually. There is a deep transformation that happens in your discernment. You no longer need long explanations to recognize misalignment. You no longer require repeated patterns to confirm what your spirit already understands. You begin to see through energy, consistency, and spiritual fruit rather than emotional familiarity. And this shift is not something you forced, it is something God developed through exposure to truth that once hurt but now informs your wisdom. And as this wisdom grows, so does your peace. But this peace is different from comfort. It is not the absence of challenges, it is the absence of confusion. It is the ability to stand in situations without losing your internal stability. And this is one of the clearest signs of elevation, when external changes no longer dictate internal chaos. Because God is teaching you how to remain grounded even when surroundings are shifting. You may also begin to notice that your circle becomes smaller, but your clarity becomes larger. Not everyone who left was a loss, many were a release. And not everyone who stays is permanent, some are still being evaluated by alignment. But your dependence on external validation decreases because God is strong, strengthening your internal confirmation system. You begin to trust what you sense in the spirit more than what people present outwardly. And in this season, God also begins to rebuild your identity. Not the identity shaped by relationships, but the identity rooted in purpose. Because exposure strips away illusions, separation removes attachments, but elevation restores identity alignment. You start remembering who you are outside of emotional dependency, outside of validation cycles, outside of relational influence. And this remembrance is powerful because it is not emotional, it is spiritual recognition returning. There is also a shift in how you pray. Your prayers become less about confusion and more about direction. Less about asking why things happened and more about asking for understanding of what is next. Because elevation changes the nature of communication with God. You are no longer seeking explanation for what has passed, you are seeking clarity for what is ahead. And this forward focus is a sign that your spirit is no longer anchored in the past. And even though elevation brings peace, it also brings responsibility, because clarity requires discipline. Once you see RNs, you cannot unsee them. Once you understand alignment, you cannot return to misalignment without awareness. And this awareness becomes a filter that protects your future decisions. You become more intentional with your energy, more selective with your access, more sensitive to spiritual consistency. God also begins to reposition your expectations. What once satisfied you emotionally no longer feels sufficient spiritually. You start craving depth over surface, truth over appearance, substance over convenience. And this shift can feel isolating at times, because not everyone around you has entered that level of awareness yet. But God uses this isolation not to disconnect you, but to refine your focus so you are not distracted by what cannot grow with you. And in this refined state, opportunities begin to appear differently. You no longer chase, you discern. You no longer force, you align. You no longer settle, you evaluate. And this shift in approach is not human effort alone. It is the result of exposure breaking illusions, separation breaking attachment, and elevation rebuilding clarity. There is also a deeper healing that takes place in this stage. Not the healing that comes from explanation, but the healing that comes from understanding. Because when you finally see why certain things had to end, your spirit stops resisting the past. You stop needing closure from people because God gives you comprehension beyond conversation. And this comprehension settles what emotional answers could not resolve. And as this continues, you begin to realize that elevation is not about becoming more visible to people, but becoming more aligned with purpose. Some seasons are not about being seen more, but about seeing more clearly. And that clarity becomes your new strength. It protects you without fear, guides you without confusion, and anchors you without dependency. And even though life may still be unfolding with new questions, your internal foundation is no longer shaken by uncertainty in the same way. Because exposure taught you discernment, separation taught you detachment, and elevation is now teaching you stability. A stability that does not depend on who stays or leaves, but on what God is building within you, and still unfolding as your spirit continues to rise into clarity that no longer needs validation from what has already been removed.